let's talk about Ukraine's atomic option. We've talked about this a little bit before in the channel, but I realized that we've never done a full segment on it. And after this report was published by the Times, I thought that this is the appropriate time to talk about this taboo. And this is a taboo. It is uncomfortable because from a moral level, considering what the Ukrainians agreed to, morally, it can probably easily be justified, the Ukrainians reattaining atomic weapons, but it's something that basically none of the world wants. The Russians don't want it for obvious reasons. Nuclear non-proliferation activists don't want it because the type of signal it would send after Ukraine's denuclearization and renuclearization, what type of signal that would send to the world, another state being attaining atomic weapons, and if that would encourage other people to do the same, the narrative that would be sent of Ukraine, gave it up and then took it back after they were invaded, and the signal would be, if you give up your nukes, you get invaded, you get your nukes back, then you have security, and it could spur a lot of people grabbing atomic weapons, and the more countries that have atomic weapons, the more chances you have for failure. And then the West doesn't like it because the West doesn't want there to be another pressure point for a potential atomic war, and for all the reasons that they didn't want Ukraine to have it originally back in the 90s that led to the Budapest memorandum being signed and Ukraine giving up their atomic weapons. And by the way, when we talk about the Budapest memorandum, and for those of you who don't know, even though we've said this quite a lot on the channel, we might always have new guests, the Budapest Memorandum was an agreement signed in 1994 by the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, where after the Russians had kind of low-key threatened military intervention if the Ukrainians did not give up their atomic weapons, the Ukrainians gave up their atomic weapons to the Russians, including the delivery systems. Many of those delivery systems have since been fired at Ukraine on the condition that they would be able to get territorial guarantees that they would not be invaded, and that if they were invaded, they would get assistance from either the Russians or the Americans. The prime threat being, of course, the Russians, and therefore Ukraine being supported by the Americans. They wanted more. They wanted they also got the British involved here. I forgot to mention that. But that's all they could get. They couldn't get a treaty. They could only get a memorandum. They could get America's word. And then when they were invaded back in 2014, we sent them radars to look at the artillery firing at them, but not like a lot of the aid or assistance or help that they would have wanted. So the Budapest Memorandum was done under the condition that if they give up their weapons, their territory would be respected. And it hasn't. By the way, it wasn't just like, Ukraine is giving this up because, it's expensive to upkeep them and they would have to change how they're wired so that they'd be wired to Kiev and they could be launched from there instead of the control centers in Moscow. It was also, there was a pressure campaign on Ukraine, not only from the Russians, but from us as well. I don't know if you guys knew this, but we had Congress people on the floor of Congress saying that if the Ukrainians don't give up their atomic weapons, then we should starve them. That we should starve the Ukrainian population, we should cut off U.S. food aid, and after we've starved them, while the Ukrainians are in economic catastrophe, they had an inflation increase rate of over 10,000%. They went from being a country that Deutsche Bank was predicting was going to be one of the most productive and economically prosperous nations within the Soviet Union to having record-breaking inflation rates and a street kid crisis, as in children living on the street, selling themselves for money and taking drugs to ease the pain. And in that condition, it was being considered on the House floor, at least openly. It wasn't like, here's the bill to starve them, but people were talking about it to starve them. So they were in a desperate situation, and they took the pathway that of least resistance, both diplomatically and when it comes to upkeep of these weapons during an economic crisis and the possible pressure that could be placed upon them. In return for these guarantees, they are then invaded by the Russians, one of the signatories of the agreement, not once but twice in a decade. So if they're going to be invaded not once but twice, and the amount of support that Ukraine is getting, they don't believe is sufficient to protect themselves, And if they do get the support, a lot of it's pretty late. And there's talk right now that the West is going to possibly ask under a Trump admin for them to put off NATO membership for 20 years or possibly reject NATO membership altogether. We don't know for sure. You know, we're still in a transition period. We don't know what we haven't seen anything penned down and proposed. But if that's the case and they're not going to get a defense agreement and the line gets frozen, what guarantee does Ukraine have to stop a future invasion? If they don't have sufficient weapons or counterance, let's say they do, to possibly stop an invasion, if they don't want another war and they want to have the guarantee that another war will not start, point blank and period, and they're not within NATO, the only organization that has been proven to stop the Russians from invading you, what are they going to have? I mean, even if there's agreements for the United States to continue to send them weapons, how long will that last? Especially if we're talking about the Trump administration, which has shown, at least during the last term, an ability to flip-flop. And if the United States is in crisis over, say, Taiwan, and we have to, you know, let's say we go to war or we have to send tons of weapons, and it's a question of this agreement we made with the Ukrainians or the NATO alliance structure. The NATO alliance structure provides a diplomatic shield from the threat of war with over 1 billion people, which is how many people are in the NATO alliance, versus a stream of weapons in the hands of 30 to 44 million people. See, there's no atomic weapons there, threat of atomic destruction, or the leverage in stopping an invasion is much more substantive, even if we were to continue to funnel weapons into Ukraine, which, considering the stop-and-go nature of aid so far, especially during the Battle of Avdiivka, due to Republican, I'm not going to say sabotage, what's the word to use? Gridlock, partisan gridlock, completely partisan gridlock. Even that could be something that is not as solid, not as sacrosanct as something like NATO membership, where Article 5 has to be upheld, because Article 5 is the reason that NATO exists. It's the fact that the states of Europe and the United States have collectivized into a defensive whole, well, in Canada, sorry, and Australia, okay, look, have collectivized into a defensive shield that makes it you to attack one, you attack all, so attacking any is just a cost that's too much to bear. But if the agreement is that they don't get to join NATO, then the Ukrainians could face a situation where the war freezes and then reignites in 5 years once the Russians have taken time to rest. And for this reason, people have been trying to think, if we don't get NATO membership, what's the plan? What's the solution? And one of those solutions is atomic. This report by the Times is mostly an interview with an independent think tank in Ukraine that says that the Ukrainian government, and this is some officials in here as well, but we have no idea how high-ranking they could be, that the Ukrainian government is months away from creating an atomic bomb. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean the Ukrainian government has started production of an atomic bomb, but that if the Ukrainian government so desired to pursue the production of atomic weapons, they could, and then could attain them within months. Now, the way that this article and this think tank proposes it would be done is not by making these new research facilities that would then synthesize and, make these bombs from scratch. The way that this would be done is by taking spent fuel rods and other existing resources that they have from, the nuclear facilities that they have and from Soviet times, taking the spent material and then turning those into rudimentary atomic weapons that would be, I believe, 1/10 the strength of Fat Man, which we dropped on Japan. But the amount they say that could be produced is hundreds. And so if we're talking about hundreds of bombs, even if they're not the strength of Fat Man, you know, and they're not the strength of our biggest weapons, if you have 100 of them, the quantity makes up for the quality. Now, maybe if they had bigger research facilities and billions and billions and billions and billions more dollars, they could make more atomic weapons and bigger and more effective and more modern, I guess you could say. And I don't know, no, I wouldn't say modern, more powerful atomic weapons, but those are not the resources that Ukraine has at its disposal. It has the resource of a former scientific center for the Soviet Union that is made up of a lot of atomic scientists. And it proposes some theories in here for how exactly this path would go. But I've given you the general pathway, that they'd be using the spent material that they already have to take those and make rudimentary bombs in the hundreds that would be nuclear weapons. And that would mean the renuclearization of Ukraine. Even if it's not, you know, Tsar Bomba, if you drop 10 of those on the city of Kursk, if you take 10 of those and you drop them on Belgorod, you drop them on anywhere really, you can destroy a city. Now, there's a question of delivery methods. There's a question of how you would get this weapon from point A to point B. But the Ukrainians have a missile development program. We don't know how far along it is. I hear rumors this way and that way. I'm not going to comment on the rumors or the reports because it could be more optimistic than it really is. And I don't want to have my biases, you know, play into that. But I'm sure with enough time, they could find some delivery method. So as a concept, let's talk about this as a concept for a moment. But before we do that, I do just want to quickly say that I don't know if I buy this. In fact, I would even lean towards it being unlikely. The first thing is, there's not even complete scientific agreement that this is necessarily possible. And there have been many that have commented on this. But the first person I'm just going to use, because I think he put it in the clearest way, and a lot of this is pretty, like, you know, science terms that you might not be familiar with and that I'm not super familiar with, but I did my best to parse it. This is from Dr. Jeffrey Lewis. He is on the Security Advisory Board for the State Department. He is also a professor at, I forget what it was called. Thank you. The Middlebury Institute. I forgot the name Middlebury. It's not a typical name. He wrote about the problem behind this plan. Those 7 tons of plutonium, that's the amount that Ukraine has, 7 tons of plutonium, are mixed into 1,350 tons of highly radioactive spent fuel. To use any in a bomb, Ukraine would need to reprocess some of that 1,350 tons of radioactive metal to chemically separate the plutonium. Ukraine does not currently have such a facility. Ukraine would have to build such a reprocessing plant. China built a plant to process about 50 tons of spent fuel a year. It took 10 years to build from 1993 to 2003 and cost 1.3 billion RBM, over $1 billion today. Could Ukraine do it faster and cheaper? In 1977, the ORNL, which is the Oak Ridge Lab, claimed a proliferator could build a simple and quick reprocessing facility in 4 to 6 months. Others disagreed. The U.S. Government Accountability Office concluded that 4 to 6 months was not highly probable, but credible in some circumstances. I will say, though, in this theory, this theory of super fast production, even if it was possible, which, again, it's like, I don't know, it would mean a lot of risk taking by the government to do it that fast, both for the personnel and the exposure to radiation, and for the country if there was to be some, well, disaster. And Ukraine has a particularly traumatic history when it comes to radioactive disasters. So that the Ukrainian government, Zelensky's administration, taking on that type of risk, they would have to be in a particularly desperate situation. And they might, in that desperate situation, be willing, have the willpower to do it. But the question of personnel is still an open one. Ukraine is full of former atomic scientists. Again, it was a scientific hub for the Soviet Union. A lot of those scientists are still alive, but you would need them in quantity. And I do not know if you can call all of those people out of retirement to engage in this program. I'm sure they have other more modern scientists as well, but who's going to be working with the Ukrainians on this? Is it going to be the American government? Is Donald Trump going to provide them with these scientists? Is it going to be any country in Europe? Is it going to be the French? Is it going to be the British? I don't think so. I don't think they would, honestly, for the reason of nuclear nonproliferation and because of fears of escalation, the same fears that have hampered aid efforts for the entirety of the war, they would not be willing to do so. And I'm not saying it's impossible. My point isn't that the Ukrainians can't do it. My point is I think it would probably take longer than what the Times is suggesting. And in fact, I know Oliver Carroll, who is the editor for The Economist. Is he the editor? No, he's a foreign correspondent for The Economist. Sorry, I forget the exact roles. Forgive me. He responded to this story after talking to some advisors, talking to some officials in the administration. And he responded saying, "I'm reliably told of Ukraine developing nukes as per the Times article is nonsense. Blah, blah, blah," was the response of a high-place official I spoke to. One theory that was proposed by a response was, it's evidently signaling to Trump. And Oliver Carroll responded, "Right, but it appears to have been an initiative that was not approved at the top." And so the theory is that this Times article, and according to Oliver Carroll, this was not approved at the top, this theory, but it was done by somebody, or at least he thinks this is the case, in order to signal to Trump the lengths Ukraine would go to defend its sovereignty if it was not included in organizations like NATO. So the idea would be that this atomic gambit would not just be to challenge the Russians. The threat of the atomic gambit would be something to challenge the West. It would not only be challenging the security balance in Europe as them, like, as a possible escalation threat that's going to scare the West, but it's also, of course, a challenge to the moral foundations of the Budapest memorandum, because if the Russians violated this for over a decade, then why can't they go back? The foundation, the moral foundation for them giving up atomic weapons was the guarantee of their sovereignty. They've given up the weapons. Now they've been invaded. There's been a decade for it to be solved, and now there's the threat of it being frozen again and being reignited in the future if there's not a good deal. And if that is the case, that there's a real threat of it being reignited in the future, what moral foundation could any Western leader claim to tell the Ukrainians no when they try to pursue the weapons that many of them have in their own arsenals? What authority, moral authority, would the British or the French or the United States be able to claim to tell the Ukrainians, no, you cannot have the weapons that you gave up? Not even the same weapons, much, much weaker weapons. Much weaker weapons, if we're talking about the process that would be used here. You do not have the authority, or you should not do that on moral grounds, considering that they gave up their arsenal for the respect of their territory. You couldn't reject it on moral grounds, and if the Ukrainians could attain atomic weapons easily, or like that without having the program destroyed, having the facilities blown up. If you had to build these facilities underground, by the way, to try to stop it from getting blown up and try to hide the development of a program like this, you'd have to build it underground, and it would probably take longer to build it underground, which again extends the timetable, which comes back to my earlier point. I think this would be a process of years, not months, especially if they wanted to do it safely, which, considering Ukraine's history, I think it would be not the worst suggestion. So, now that we've gone through the information, number one, I think Ukraine can do this if they really wanted to. And for those of you who doubt, if North Korea can do it, I don't understand why Ukraine can't do it. If North Korea can muster up the resources to get atomic weapons, then I do not know why the Ukrainians wouldn't be able to do the same thing, considering the amount of innovation, willpower, and desire to resist that they have. Not to mention some backlog of atomic knowledge from their history, and they have spent plutonium. So they already have some of the resources that would be necessary to start this process. It's a question of time. It's a question of me not really believing the time frame put forward by the Times and the possibility that this is signaling to Trump to some extent. Now, I don't know. Oliver Carroll says it was not from the top. Maybe it was from the bottom.
Gas money.
Hey, thank you for the $10 for the gas money. Now we're heading out east. We're heading to the Pacross front very soon. So, you know, it's expensive. You got to pay for housing. You got to pay for gas. You got to pay for fixer costs. You got to pay for, usually, you know, energy drinks and cigarettes for the boys. So I think they can get nukes. I think it would take longer. I think it would take resources. And this is the big sticking point for me. They could try to start a program like this now under the desire of long-term, in a year, 2, 3 years from now, they would have it. So when another war could be rearing its head, if they're forced into negotiations, they could take out this trap card if they are, you know, not discovered in the plan of sabotage before then, and the Russians strike it. But they need resources. They need money. They need to be able to take money from somewhere and fund this. And it's not going to be the United States that does it, unless Zelensky is this. If Trump says Zelensky is a great salesman, he's going to have to be the salesman of the century to get Trump to agree to it. But Trump's such a wild card, you never know for sure, but I still am heavily going to bet against it. They're going to need to get the money from somewhere. They're going to need to get the resources from somewhere. And right now, Ukraine's fiscal stability is propped up by European aid and by, loans. Them being able to conjure up whatever amount of money. This report says that some people could do it cheaper, but if you wanted to do it safe, if you want to do it well, you're talking about something that costs billions of dollars. Potentially. And so where are they going to get that money from? I mean, the Ukrainians are investing like $1.6 billion, I believe, this upcoming year into military production. If you're a Ukrainian leader, if you're Zelensky, if you're Yarmak whispering in his ear, if you're whoever, are you going to be thinking, I want to start this atomic weapons program, which could be sabotaged, which, if discovered, could undercut aid that we need, for the hope that we would have these weapons later if NATO membership did not pass through? Do you do that? Or do you take that $1 billion that you would have invested there for an end that you would not even see probably while the war is still going on, or as at least a possibility while the war is still going on, when you could instead take that money and invest $1 billion into drone production and see the effect of that within months? So where do you put the money? Do you put the money in the, let me read the quote, in the God of atomic weapons? And the reason I'm saying the God of atomic weapons is because there was a quote from this I read. And even though I don't know how much credibility I give the Times piece, there was a quote from this that really took me back, really threw me back.
Great work. Thank you.
Hey, Swells, thank you so much for the $10. I appreciate that, buddy. It means a lot. It really does help. More than you know. Let me read you this quote. I was surprised by the reverence the United States has for Russia's nuclear threat, and it may have cost us the war. They treat these atomic weapons as some kind of god, so perhaps it is also time for us to pray to this god. Oh my God, bar for bar, line for line. That's the type of stuff you'd imagine to see like the villain at the start of like a Call of Duty game, like the West has that's a hard line. That's kind of some fire, honestly. That's atomic fire right there. But that's the question that the Ukrainian leadership would have to face. Do you invest for this risky project that is going to see returns probably later and would be best used as diplomatic leverage to deter, or the immediate needs of the armed forces, which right now are stretched thin? I don't know if you guys saw the updates around Kupiansk, but it's not good. It's not good. Somebody said in chat the answer is always in between. I mean, if you split it in half and then put like half the money into the research program and half the money into drones, I'm sure, yeah, you get some drones immediately. and you have some sort of program for the atomic weapons, but then it's going to extend the timetable. Honestly, best case scenario, and I'm not saying that there's no moral right for Ukraine to have these weapons.
Alex CJP has donated $10. With all the unpredictability that comes with the second Trump term, I say Ukrainians should learn to stop worrying and love the bomb.
Love the bomb, be the bomb, become the bomb. I'm not saying that there isn't a moral foundation for Ukraine to have a bomb. And if worst case scenarios come to pass, I do think them considering that is more than warranted. I think best case scenario, the threat of Ukraine's renuclearization could be used diplomatically as leverage to get concessions out of Western allies for them to realize that Ukraine's security and safety and sovereignty of its people is not a joke. They take it seriously, and that they're willing to do everything possible, claw with tooth and nail for their country, considering the stakes of this war, the national survival of Ukraine, when Putin has declared multiple times, both in writing and publicly, that if Ukraine does not exist as an extension of Russia, as a proxy of Russia, as a satellite state of Russia, as part of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, then it cannot exist at all and must be destroyed. And they're not Ukrainians, they're little Russians. So they come in, smash the culture, change all the names of the cities and the locations from Ukrainian to Russian, arrest the civil society leaders, destroy freedom of the press, destroy judicial independence, whatever amount of it may exist here, even those problems with corruption, destroy the democratic system, and destroy Ukraine. And you know, a state's main job is to survive, is to exist, is to perpetuate itself into the future. And so if you put that state in survival mode, it will do what it is necessary to do to survive. And so my advice would be, don't make it so that Ukraine's necessary option is to get these weapons, because if you make that the case and you leave them high and dry, don't be surprised if a desperate cornered nation that's seen mass graves before does what's necessary to not see them again. Man, this is not good that this is the style of conversation that we're having, by the way. The fact that this is the type of conversation that we're having right now, it's not a good sign.